In this lecture, we want to update the sort property whenever there's a query parameter on the initial request. We'll continue working in the song component file. We can use a lifecycle function to check if there's a query parameter in the URL. If there is one, we'll apply the value to the sort data property. In the created lifecycle function, we're going to destructure the this.route.query object for the sort property. At this point in the lifecycle, the component will have been created. Every component is injected with the route object. The properties on this object will have information about the current route data, including the query parameters. It's the perfect time to update the sort data property if there's a query parameter. Make sure that you're typing route and not router. It can be easy to get them mixed up. The router object is a general object for interacting with the router in the application. In contrast, the route object will contain information about the current route. Every route object comes with a query property. It's an object representing the query parameters in the URL. We can use this to grab the sort parameter. We're going to update the sort property, but we're not going to directly assign it to the sort query parameter. We want to make sure the value is valid. The value for the sort can be two possible values, 1 or 2. We'll use a ternary operator to check if the query parameter is a valid value. If it is, we'll set the sort data property to the sort query parameter. Otherwise, we'll leave it at the default value, which is 1. There's one problem with this solution. We're updating the sort property. This update will trigger the watcher for the sort function regardless if the value changed or not. Vue will throw an error at us if we attempt to visit a URL we're already visiting. We want to avoid this error by checking if the new value matches the query parameter. Go back to the sort watcher. We'll add a conditional statement before pushing the query parameter. We'll check if the new value argument is equal to the this.route.query.sort property. If it is, we'll return the function. This condition will prevent the watcher from updating the route if the query parameter already matches the sort value. Let's try testing the application in the browser. On the page for a song, we won't be able to see a query parameter applied to the router because we aren't changing the sorting order for the comments. Despite that, the sorting still works, which is what we want. Let's try changing the sorting order. As we make changes, we'll find that a query parameter has been applied to the URL. With the help of the router, we were able to apply a query parameter easily. The push function did not redirect the user away from the page. It was smart enough to understand we wanted to update the query parameter. Another thing worth noting is how the value was logged in the developer tools. Open the Vue developer tools. Under the Routing History section, we'll find the changes we made to the route. The logger will still log routes even if we're visiting the same route. Fortunately, the router will not reload a component if it's the same component from before. Under the To category, we'll find a new object was added called Query. It'll contain a list of query parameters currently active on the route. We're able to update the query parameter successfully. Let's try refreshing the page to find out with the query parameter still intact. After refreshing the page, the drop-down for sorting the comments has been correctly updated to the query parameter's value. The correct component gets loaded even if the route is slightly different. Query parameters won't affect the path. The router is smart enough to differentiate between the path and query. We previously learned about path parameters for storing values in the URL. It was helpful to use path parameters because we were able to create a dynamic route for various songs. We could have used path parameters to implement this solution, but it's not exactly ideal. Let me explain further. We have two options for storing dynamic values in our URLs. The first is by using query parameters. I'm showing a very simplified example of what a song URL would look like. We're going to use the ID to generate a unique URL. Storing the value in a query parameter is one way to go about it. In the second example, I'm using a path parameter. Rather than storing the ID in a query parameter, we could store the ID in a segment of the path. That's completely possible because the Vue router supports dynamic paths. It's a common feature in most routers. It looks cleaner compared to query parameters. The question is, why is using path parameters a more viable option than query parameters? Technically, either solution works. Vue won't throw an error. Search engines won't have a problem with indexing our site if we use query parameters. It's not so much about errors, but what is considered good standard practice. The general rule of thumb is this. Path parameters are used to retrieve a single or multiple resources. Query parameters are used to filter or sort through data and resources. For sorting comments, using query parameters made sense because we were sorting the comments on the page. For a single song, using a path parameter would make sense because we're retrieving a single resource. By following this practice, you can achieve a more organized route structure. It's a pattern you'll see in most applications. Not every company uses this pattern for one reason or another. Older apps may have adopted a different pattern because the pattern I mentioned is still relatively new. Determining which to use will come with experience. We'll leave it here. We'll continue our work in the next lecture.